Good morning, Elan. How are you?
I'm great. Good morning. How are you?
Yeah, really good, really good. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join this series of Sentientist conversations. And as you know, it's a series of discussions really about what I think of as the two deepest philosophical questions and the most important ones. What's real and who matters? The questions of epistemology and ethics and the sort of journey people have taken to work out the answers to those questions for themselves so far. And I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to develop and popularize this really pluralistic, simple worldview called Sentientism, which suggests that when we're thinking about the what's real question, we should take a naturalistic approach where we use evidence and reason from reality to try and understand it with some humility. And when it comes to the who matters question, the clue is in the name, that every sentient being, any being that can experience things, particularly suffering, flourishing, good or bad stuff, should matter in our moral consideration, whatever ethical system we use. But I'm lucky in these conversations to talk to a dazzling variety of people. Some of them agree with sentientism and some of them don't. So it'll be great to understand your own philosophical journey and where you've got to now. But before we get on to those big questions, how would you best introduce yourself and what you do?
So many different hats to think about. Well,
Yeah.
these days I am a cultural anthropologist, but I primarily teach animal studies courses, which is sort of a dream job because it's my favorite thing to teach. I'm an assistant professor of the practice at Wesleyan University in environmental studies and science and society program. And then we recently got an animal studies minor approved, so I'm now the coordinator of the animal studies minor as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Well, we've been lucky to, so far I've talked to astrophysicists and philosophers and sci-fi authors and CEOs and volunteers and people running NGOs and neurologists and all sorts. But I think you're the first cultural anthropologist. So it's great to
Oh,
have you here. It'll
exciting.
be interesting perspective to bring to the mix. Yeah. And we have a bit of podcast overlaps as well, because I loved your conversations on knowing animals and our hen house. I tend to steal a lot of brilliant guests from them and just bring them on and ask them these big questions here. And I've been lucky enough to be a guest on both of those too. So it's great to have
Oh,
some
that's great.
podcast connect. And I think you're working with Catherine Gillespie as well, who's been a previous guest of
That's
mine
right.
too.
Yeah. Yeah. Katie and I
Yeah, so
are
we have some podcast network overlaps already. Yeah. So let's delve into this first big philosophical question. This question of what's real and what's true. And for many of my guests, that's a story about whether they grew up originally in a culture and a society and a family that was maybe more religious or supernatural or mystical in some sense, or one that was more naturalistic, maybe atheistic in their mindset. So and how that side of their thinking has changed over their life, if it has. So you can wind the clock back as far as you like to tell a sort of epistemological story about how you think about that stuff, about the nature of the universe.
Interesting. Well, I was raised mostly secularly. My dad had a hodgepodge of beliefs, like drawing a little bit on Christianity, a little bit on Buddhism, I guess a little bit spiritual. He mostly talked about believing in reincarnation. Um, but now looking back on it, I think it was a pretty westernized, filtered version of whatever he thought reincarnation was. I don't think he was basing it on texts, but
Yeah, yeah,
but I probably just assumed whatever he believed in was real until about the age of 12, 11, when I remember first being aware of the fact that there were several major religions that all claimed truth to varying degrees and kind of came to the conclusion that probably none of them were right because they're mutually exclusive to a large extent. Um, and that was like the 12-year-old version of logically thinking through that. I didn't dive deeper on that issue, but I think ever since then I haven't gone back to thinking that any kind of metaphysical or supernatural explanation is the basis of our reality. And I think I've basically been, I guess you would call it, materialist with a small m, or a um, like empiricist with a small e, ever since then. And I haven't um, felt the need to understand things through any kind of metaphysical religious lens. So um, I I think probably when we die, and that's the end of things, and that just makes our lives more poignant and important because of the period of time that we're here and we get to experience things. I don't have any real sense of where creation originated. I believe the current theories about Big Bang and universal expansion and possibly even cyclical collapse and re-expansion. I don't delve deep into astrophysics or anything, so I don't know where that stuff stands, but I don't feel any sense of needing to understand the mystery around it either, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pretty clean story, quite similar to mine as well, actually. And when you were 12, what did that process feel like? Was it just a sort of simple fading away of those things? Was there some degree of challenge or stress socially or in your family? Was there some psychological difficulty as well? Did you feel like you were losing something? Or was it sad to give up the idea of reincarnation or some of these other factors? Or was it just pretty smooth and direct and never look back?
Yeah, it was mostly smooth and direct. I think in some ways, to the extent that I can remember any of those kind of feelings, it was a little bit of a relief. I'd been given a book on Bible stories by a Jehovah's Witness at the bus stop, like a children's book, and I read the whole thing because it had fantastic art. But I remember going through the book, and at a certain point, thinking this God person is really cruel and kind of like a villain. And
yeah.
And I gave the guy the book
is he the baddie? Yeah,
yeah, right. And so I thought that can't be the entity that created all of this. And so I think, if anything, probably felt reassuring, and this is going to sound maybe contradictory, but reassuring in a humbling kind of way, that like I'm a tiny part of this vast universe and everybody else is a tiny part of it, and we're all no less important for that. But I think, yeah, like, I guess, to back up a second, if I do think about it, I probably have to say that I'm mildly agnostic, in the sense that I know that I don't know where things came from, but I also imagine if there is some kind of deity or entity that created things, it's so vastly more complex than us that I imagine it's sort of analogous to like us being worried about microbial politics or something. I doubt that we're given much more thought than any other aspect of creation, if there's even a thing out there thinking about us. But
yeah, so you're deep. So you're sort of skeptical of the idea in general, but you're deeply skeptical of the idea that it's a sort of human analog old guy with a beard sitting on a cloud with opinions about us. Yeah.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, definitely. And so then I think it ultimately doesn't really matter what this, if there is an entity, what it thinks, that like we're here to make our own choices about how we go through life.
And people, it's interesting the way you put that, because people can take this sort of realization in different ways, because some people can feel it's a negative thing, that they've lost a sort of kind, all-powerful being that cares about you, and all of a sudden you're sort of lost in a universe that is just physics churning away. But other people like you can actually find that quite freeing. It's, in a way, it can be quite oppressive to think that you're the point and we're the point of the entire universe. And there's something quite freeing about recognizing that in some sense, we're relatively insignificant, but we, as you said, in our own lives, we can find our own meaning and still make a contribution and do things that we and those around us care about. So
that's exactly right. Yeah, I think that sums it up pretty well.
Yeah, thank you. And it also sounds like, again, similar to me, you haven't sort of found an alternative path to thinking about the transcendent or the spiritual. So some people, many of my guests, will move away from a religious worldview and, like me, just become a straightforward sort of naturalistic thinker. I'll, with humility, base my views on evidence and reason, and that's pretty much it. And I don't see anything compelling that suggests there's anything supernatural to me at the moment. Others will leave a formalized religious worldview, but despite the fact, as you said, there's so many different conflicts between the different religious worldviews, they'll try and find some sort of common core that is about some transcendent power or some interconnectedness or some sense of spirit, or that takes them into I'm not religious, but I am spiritual, and they still have a rich sense of the supernatural there. But it sounds like you haven't felt that as a tempting route either.
No, I would say not a spiritual. I would not use the term spiritual to describe it. I think that there's a certain sense of wonder and appreciation about existence and getting to experience all of this. I had an experience when I turned 40. I I went on a ayahuasca retreat, and I thought I would try this. And everybody in the group afterwards, the next morning, were talking about the experiences they had, and most people had a very spiritual frame for describing their experiences. They all saw their experiences as the grandmother showing them different things, which, as a cultural anthropologist, I found very problematic, because these were all white people, and this was a white person guiding it, she was a shaman. But it was the experience that was available to me in New York State. So I went there out of somewhat curiosity to just see how this is getting co-opted and repackaged and stuff too. But my experience of it was just that I felt pretty in touch with the particles of the universe. I mean, I'm sure I was imagining particles in a way that they don't exist out there in reality. But when we were going around the circle, I said, I don't have any sort of anthropomorphic encounters to explain. I just felt deeply in touch with creation and appreciative of the fact that I'm a part of it. Which didn't go over. It went over like a lead balloon in that circle.
Really?
Like, just it just went on to the next
You're not
person.
following the script here, Elan. You're not following the script.
But yeah, so I think that experience, although I wouldn't describe it as spiritual, is probably some similar feelings to what somebody might get out of having a sort of a spiritual relationship to the world.
Yeah, and I'm super lucky because I don't teach properly, because I'm an amateur in all of these fields, but I do run workshops and classes with school kids talking about philosophy and worldviews. And that's one of the things I will quite often say. Many of the kids in the classes with me have a religious worldview, and I'm explicitly talking about non-religious worldviews too. But I think the way you laid that out is exactly spot on. Right? I think the sense of wonder and awe and interconnectedness that you can get with a spiritual or a religious worldview, I can feel that too, right? Just through an amateur understanding of physics and the fact we are all connected, and just reality is awesome enough without needing magic on top. And I think sometimes the magic almost kills the awe and mystery for me. Right? I prefer real, the real awe and wonder. But
Yeah, I very much relate to that.
And it was interesting that you talked about your experience with ayahuasca, which I've never experimented with myself. I've never had that type of experience, but quite a few of my guests have. And the experience seems to bifurcate people's ways of thinking quite cleanly, and it can sometimes change their worldview radically as well. So sometimes people who have a spiritual or a religious bent will go through that experience and they will interpret it in a spiritual and religious sense. But sometimes people with a quite naturalistic, hard-edged, evidence-based scientific way of thinking will go through that experience and will come out and say, I understand reality in a completely different way. Whereas others, like you, and I think I would probably follow this path as well, would just go, that's taught me something amazing about the plasticity of the human mind and the possible ranges of sentient experiences. And, I've given me a rich sense of awe and wonder. But reality isn't any different, right? I've just had a psychological experience that is very rich and powerful and resonant. And those people, the people in the first two camps, will say to me, well, you say that now, Jamie, but once you've tried it and you've seen, the grandmother, you've experienced the earth as Gaia, you've talked to the mystical elves, all will become clear. And well, maybe. But I think I'd be, more down your track of taking different lessons from the experience.
Hearing you describe that, it's interesting, because I'm realizing I certainly went into it with an expectation, and I'm sure that shaped it. I was thinking this is going to be brain chemicals giving me experiences inside my brain, and the chemicals are made up of molecules, which are made up of atoms. And so I think that's why it kind of went in that direction for me. But I think with those kind of experiences, there's a certain amount of ego dissolution which people experience, which lends itself to being experienced as a spiritual kind of journey. And what I realized is, I think what's left there, what made me feel a deeper appreciation and sense of connection to other things, was the kind of seed of sentience, to put it in those terms, that I share with most other living things, I guess, or at least other animals. And that kind of commonality underneath the parts that are me specifically, but that part of
that was part of the connection, was Yeah, the
I think,
rawness of the experience itself. And it
right.
seems to have some parallels with people who've um, uh, gone deep into meditation practices as well, and that dissolution of the self seems to be one of those other things. And and my sense is that this conception we have of the self is completely understandable from an evolutionary perspective. It will be useful for the information processing in our minds to conceive of ourselves as an entity that needs to survive and reproduce. So, calling it an illusion might be too strong, right? But it's a way of modeling ourselves that makes complete evolutionary sense, but isn't necessarily some canonically distinct magical thing. And I think that idea that the self is this distinct, almost magical thing is what leads into ideas of heaven and hell and reincarnation, because it's almost impossible to imagine this thing not existing. But when you go through an ayahuasca experience or a deep meditation experience, you can, I think, get to this point of recognizing the raw experience, maybe, and even without necessarily an experiencer, it's just thoughts emerge and experience happens, and the self as being this sort of imaginary homunculus that's sitting somewhere in your head.
Right.
It fades away. So yeah, some fascinating parallels there. Yeah. So that's helped answer that sort of what's real question, or it's in a way it's more about how do we work out what's real, right? So rather than it being a definite statement, there is no supernatural. I quite like the thinking about the method, the naturalistic method of just using evidence and reason and then following them where they take you. So I think that's quite a clear answer. We probably share the way we answer those questions. But the second question is just as important, and it's the questions of ethics. And okay, we understand, we've got a way of understanding reality now, but what matters in that? What should we care about, and how should we care, and what's significant morally and ethically, and then also critically, who matters? And it's an interesting question to ask of someone who doesn't really have a religious worldview, because quite often the religious worldview comes with a package of ethics as well. There's the Quran or the Bible, lessons from the Bhagavad Gita or whatever it is, right? And people like you and me who don't subscribe to a religious way of thinking don't have those at all. So how would you describe the journey you've taken in thinking about ethics and morality and what matters and what do good and bad and right and wrong even mean, if those are even sensible questions?
So there's a I imagine a funny beginning to this, which is probably around the same age that I was having thoughts about religion and how I felt about religion. I've been a comic book fan for a very long time, and Spider-Man was my favorite superhero. And the sort of basic moral of most Spider-Man stories is this idea with great power comes great responsibility. But to me, as a child, the way that I interpreted that was that we have a sort of obligation to help each other when we can. And I think that what informed that and what that sort of developed into over time was also this sense of fairness in terms of some people's extra benefit isn't really worth anybody else's suffering, and that there's a way that we can all be there for each other to minimize suffering so that nobody has to feel extra bad or feel extra hurt. And I think that's basically just been the basis of it. In a way, I actually really liked how you described sentientism at the beginning, because I think that fits well with how I think about it. I don't have a utilitarian perspective of maximizing pleasure or minimizing suffering in that sense, but more like for each individual who exists and experiences the world, they deserve to be able to have minimal suffering and maximum enjoyment of life. And so that then shapes, what decisions you make about how you go through the world and how you interact with people.
How different do you think your journey would be if your favorite comic had been Judge Dredd instead of Spider-Man?
Yeah, right. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'd be on a very different podcast talking about like Law and Order.
Maybe so. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think and empathy is a component, because I think it helps understand, or it informs your ability to understand that not just what it might be like for somebody else to suffer, or another being to suffer, and not want that for them, but also to understand why people might do things that seem like bad actions, but are maybe informed by not a desire to be bad or hurt, but a response to trauma, or a desperation for a need, or things along those lines. And so I think that helps inform that kind of perspective too, because I could see somebody easily criticizing that and being like, well, that's great. You want to be fair to everybody, but what about the people who want to like steal everything and beat everybody else up and take their stuff and whatever? And so I think, I mean, I'm not trying to suggest that I think that's all okay, and I don't care what anybody else does, but more like having an openness to understanding what might be motivating people even in conflicts, I think is useful.
And I think that's one of the toughest idea. A lot of people like an idea of some form of universal compassion, but I think one of the toughest things is to extend that compassion to people and other beings that do harm. And that doesn't mean you have to be weak or appease or let them, harm others, but at least engage with them in a way that recognizes that their experiences matter too, and you wouldn't egregiously cause them harm for no reason, right? We might have other reasons why you might need to constrain or harm to protect others, but I think that's one of the toughest things, to extend compassion to others that we see of as bad actors. And you also there's another interesting theme there, which is about, it's all too easy to look at someone who is doing something you think is harmful and just write them off as an evil person, right? It's quite convenient. And one of my previous conversations with the philosopher Neil Levy, and he was sort of giving me some correctives about understanding people's epistemic context, and you've got to understand what their values are, what they've come to believe is true, and in a sense, most people are operating in a way that they think is rational and compassionate. The psychopathy is quite rare, right? So understanding that context can really help us too. Yeah.
Oh, that's right. Almost nobody's the villain of their own story.
Yeah, that's pretty rare, isn't it? Yeah. And you mentioned earlier on the way I tried to frame this sentientism thing. This is probably one of the ways my own thinking shifted as I've been working on this amateur project, is because I probably did start out with, when people talk about sentience, quite often they'll think of Peter Singer and a sort of utilitarian context. And I still have some sympathy for that way of thinking to some degree. That might have been where I came from. But as I've been thinking about it, I've been trying to deliberately make the sentientism idea more ethically pluralistic, such that it's not about sentience and just suffering. It's about compassion for sentient beings and recognizing them as individuals in their own right, which can take you into more, deontological ways of thinking about beings as ends in themselves, or as subjects of care in a feminist care ethic, or subjects of, kindness in a virtue ethic. So I quite like the idea of saying, well, you don't need to specify a particular ethical system as long as every sentient being warrants serious moral consideration. That setting that scope of inclusion is the most important thing, and then we can still fight over, utilitarianism versus those other systems later.
Right. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I was just thinking about this recently. There's a news story in the New York Times about Elon Musk's company Tesla. Now they have about 5 lawsuits against them for deaths caused by the faulty autopilot software that still doesn't work. And the article is sort of explaining how his perspective on risk and benefit is very much a utilitarian one and somewhat long-termist. And this idea that the benefit and good that will come from this kind of technology being perfected totally outweighs the cost of a few deaths. But what really struck me about that was that the people who are dying, their lives matter to them tremendously, and they don't get any say in whether or not they're a part of an experiment that's just happening on public roads, and that there has to be a way to account for that in a functioning system of ethics. That it's deeply flawed if you can take individual lives and sort of throw them away without their consent because you think that it will actually benefit more people in the long run.
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting because there's I sort of back away from utilitarianism partly for some of those reasons. So I'm probably still a consequentialist in the sense that ultimately I care about the experiences of sentient beings, ideally from their perspective, and those things are consequences. So in a sense, that's what I care about. I mean, you might even joke that the reason people support a virtue ethics approach or a care ethics approach or a the ontological ethics approach is ultimately because they think those types of ethics deliver the best consequences. So in a sense, it's quite hard to avoid that really broad sense of consequentialism. But I share that nervousness about some approaches to utilitarianism, which relentlessly maximize, which talk about aggregating suffering across different beings when no being really feels that aggregated suffering, and particularly ideas of offsetting. You might offset my suffering in some spreadsheet, but I'm still suffering, right? You just cannot get rid of that. It doesn't get erased. And I think there's, as you also said, we're very familiar with the problems of ends justifying means, and then you realize that actually those means are ends in their own rights too, and maybe you've made a wrong calculation, and those aren't just ends and means in situations where your ends are evil, right? That can be true where you think your ends are honorable and really good and some utopian vision, right? And therefore you're willing to cause enormous suffering and death on the way to this glorious utopian end state, right? There's plenty of dangers there too. So
right, exactly.
Yeah. So we've already answered the second question in a sense about who matters, because we've both been talking about sentience and sentient beings more than humans. So what was your journey on that sort of moral scope question? Because our societal default generally is pretty strongly anthropocentric, and in some cases it's even narrower than that. It's people like me, and that we've got a world of struggle to even get to proper implementation of universal human moral consideration and rights, let alone beyond. But what was your journey in terms of thinking through moral scope, and particularly that point about going beyond the human? And how do you think about moral scope now?
I think it was probably having close relationships with other members of other species, growing up, having pets, that and a kind of openness to extending empathy. And it always struck me as silly, the idea that other animals don't have emotions and feelings and experiences, because I think that there are some things that feel intuitive to a child's mind that you almost have to think your way out of, or educate your way out of, to say, well, actually, I don't have any solid evidence that this my rabbit friend has a mind at all. Maybe he's totally just a Cartesian machine. I don't know. And until I get the empirical evidence, I just have to remain agnostic. This comes up in some of my classes sometimes, and students will point out in various contexts, like, well, we don't really know what animals want. And I say, yes, of course we don't, to a large extent, know exactly what they want or what they're feeling. But then there's always the possibility that you all are just Cartesian machines, and I'm the first person to ever develop sentience, and you're all acting like you are like me, but really I'm the only one having thoughts, and I don't know for sure that you do. But
the teenagers today will talk about other people being NPCs, non-player characters. So
exactly,
that's like their version of the, it's not quite a solipsism, but that I'm the only person who's in the zombie story here.
Right. Yeah. And obviously that can be a very long philosophical discussion, but I think as far as living your life, we all take for granted that other people, other humans that we interact with, have internal lives and emotions and feelings and desires.
It seems a prudent assumption to make. Yeah.
Right. And I never saw a good reason not to extend that to animals. I mean, as I learned more about different kinds of species and ethological evidence and so on, I understand that there are totally different ways that animals might experience the material world, and that they're based on their sort of interests and needs. They might have different wants or feelings or emotions than I can fully ever relate to. But I never saw any reason to assume that we didn't all share this kind of experience of the world to some extent. That like we were talking about earlier, that sort of kernel of sentientism or sentience that comes underneath everything else and then informs everything else.
Yeah. And those companion animals you thought of, I guess, as sort of just family members and other beings that clearly had an internal experience and that clearly mattered to you. Yeah. And how did you, and I think you're right, many kids, I think, just start off with that just because it's intuitively obvious, and I think the evidence is there as well, right? If you see other beings that are engaging with you in ways that imply that they don't like pain and they do like happiness, and scratches behind the ear, then they probably do, right? That's quite a naturalistic way of doing it. And then society, of course, trains us out of some of that stuff. But there's been some really interesting research done as well. So one of my previous guests was Matty Wilkes, who's actually studied how perceptions of species difference shift over time. And she basically, the studies they've done concluded that younger people, before they're trained into speciesism, are much less speciesist in terms of where they take ethical decisions about non-humans and humans.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. More research is already required, but it seems quite a strong story. But so I think many children would start out that way, but most children and most children would become adults who would still care about companion animals. So in a way, that gives me hope, because the vast majority of humans already have some degree of sentiocentric compassion, at least very selectively for some animals, but then they fail to make the connection more broadly. What was that part of the journey like for you when you started to think about, maybe the animals that weren't in your home but were impacted by your actions in society and systems at large?
That I think I went through a radical phase in response to that. I remember I was in high school. I had a good friend, Delcy Winders, who you should consider having on the show if you haven't. She's runs the animal law program at Vermont Law School, and
I'd love to have her on as guest. Yeah,
she's great. But we met in high school, and she explained to me why she was vegan. And I had no idea that all of these things were done to animals. That sounds horrible. I have to be vegan. And then I went through a period in my late teens, early 20s, where I think I felt a kind of rage is the wrong word, but a kind of anger at the injustice that I felt like I had to have this absolutist orientation towards wanting to help animals, or not participate in their contributing to their suffering as much as possible. And it always sat with me that it was happening out there anyway, like an awareness of the injustice.
It's like the blinkers have been taken off and you suddenly see this obvious, egregious horror. And in a way, that's a pretty obvious reaction to have. Yeah.
And I think having actually now, I'm realizing, looking back on it, spent a big part of my academic and professional career thinking about these issues, somewhat from the perspective of a cultural anthropologist, looking at how different people are trying to address them. I think that sense has mellowed a bit, not in the I don't still care about those issues, but I have a much broader sort of perspective on where I'm situated in this bigger systemic problem, and what the limits of my ability to influence it are, and what kind of interventions might be necessary to really transform it. And so I think that tempered some of the self-righteousness that people maybe associate with young vegans when they first start, not in age, but in like their period of being vegan.
And I guess there's a few different angles to that. One is just seeing the egregiousness of the horror and the frustration at how easy it would be to take a different way, and almost an anger at all of the other humans that they don't see it the same way. It's a deep frustration, and I think many of us feel that. But the second part of it, which is probably the bit that's maybe mellowed for you, is then taking that whole weight on yourself and thinking, right, therefore I need to fix this single-handedly, even though there are 7.8 billion people on the planet. And I think that second part of recognizing, how big these systemic, changes are and what we can plague, we can learn to be a bit easier on ourselves, at least, even if we don't, reduce the scale of the problem we're looking at. Yeah. And it was that clear. It was like one conversation and the light bulb went on and you were done. Wow.
I had a sense, I went through this period. I remember before giving up meat, I guess at the age of 17, there was a period where I started to look at my rabbit. My dad got my sister a rabbit when I was camping and I was older. So the rabbit and I just kind of became bonded buddies. And I remember looking at him and thinking, I don't want to do that. I don't want to eat pigs who are like this, or cows who are like this, like really kind of making that connection that I already understood in an intellectual way, but I think I was making on a more emotional level or an affective level. And I spent a couple of years just feeling guilty because I became aware of the fact that my diet was coming from this kind of violence. But I guess not feeling that strong enough to take I know people much younger who've given up those kind of aspects of an omnivorous diet, what meat first or whatever, gone all the way vegan. And maybe it was because it was the 90s somewhat, and I didn't know other people like that. But I don't say any of that to excuse myself, but I know that there was just a period of time where I didn't act on those feelings. I just felt guilty. But when I was given this explanation for how the bigger system works, and it wasn't just, I know out there they're getting killed, but it was like, this is exactly what they're experiencing in this process. It was just like that. I went from, I'd gone vegetarian about a month before, and I went from that one conversation to being vegan.
Yeah, thank you. And one of the interesting things in many of these conversations is that quite often there's a parallel in my guests' stories between the move away from a religious way of thinking to one that was more naturalistic, and living in a carnist world without really asking too many questions, to being vegan and to taking up that sentient-centric stance and putting that into practice. And you and I both had a pretty easy transition for the first one, but for some of my guests, that's been really difficult. It's been a serious wrench because a religious worldview was very central to their family and their friends and their society. And they were taking on serious social risk and went through many, many challenges to sort of make that shift. And it's quite interesting that there can sometimes be a parallel between those two shifts. You know, you're moving away from a very strong social default and striking out in a different direction. So, and it was probably compounded by the fact you were quite an angry vegan for a while as well. But what was your experience socially and family and friends from going vegan, particularly because you did it quite suddenly? Was it difficult, or was it just you just brutally pushed it through?
It wasn't socially difficult. I don't think my family understood, but I didn't get much pushback. And now that I'm thinking about it in this way, after you asked that, I realized that there's a way in which I had a kind of privilege that I didn't have to deal with any of that, and it did make it a lot easier. And I think that's something that really now people who are trying to advocate for people shifting to vegan diets should continue to be and try to be and continue to be very understanding of, because there are a lot of social and cultural challenges for people. It's not a matter of simply just deciding I'm not going to do that anymore. And I definitely didn't have to deal with that kind of turbulence. But I think also, though, it is accurate to compare it to a kind of a religious conversion experience. I think it does parallel that in a lot of ways. At least it did for me, because it was this coming to a new awareness kind of a thing, and shifting my views and throwing myself into it. And maybe that was necessary. I don't know. If I transitioned more slowly, I don't know if I would have stuck with it as well. It's hard to know those counterfactuals, but I think it is interesting to me that this sort of choice to follow an ethical program or structure, it's more than just making one choice, right? It's like, I'm going to reorient my whole life in this new way based on ethics. And I think that has some similar experiences to maybe being religious or becoming spiritual or whatever, those kind of transitions we were talking about earlier. And I think that's probably what got some of the mellowing too, is that there was, for lack of a better word, an element of dogma to it, and that I'm going to do this because I have to. And then over time, it became easier and easier. And so part of it just became like, it doesn't even feel like I'm trying to do anything anymore. And part of it was like having this different view of things and a different relation to how it all works. But, yeah.
And there's an interesting dynamic there as well, because there's, which again, I don't want to overplay this sort of parallel between the religious conversion away from a religion and the veganism thing, but there is something about feeling good because you're making a sacrifice for a worthy cause, right? And I think that can feel like a positive thing. Sometimes it can be a good thing, but I think once you get to the point of recognizing that you're not making some bold, crazy sacrifice, really, this is just you freed yourself to reflect, an ethical stance. It can take some of that spice and that edge out of it, which is probably a better better way of doing it. And many of my guests have gone through that process where they now say, I now think of it as freeing and as a joy and as an opportunity. Right? It's not some amazing, self-flagellating sacrifice I've gone through because I'm a sort of holy, sacred person and am purer than the rest of humanity. It's not that at all. It's a different direction.
Actually, I've talked to some friends who went vegan a long time ago. This was in the late 90s. And I have some nostalgia for that time because it wasn't just that feeling
when it was hard.
But it was rewarding. Like it was like always on an Easter egg hunt or something to find. We wouldn't think twice about driving 2 hours to go to a vegan restaurant that somebody discovered because they drove by it, not because we didn't have the internet then. So
mixing soy powder, into milk yourself. There's something about that.
Yeah, it was there was all these elements of praxis to it that don't or habitus to it that aren't there now when stuff is so easy to get at every store, which I'm not complaining about. I'm glad that people have an easier time in not eating animal products, but there was a component of fun and positive feedback reward for doing that sort of. It's like being like a modern day hunter gatherer. I got to go find the vegan stuff somewhere.
And there's social solidarity gains from that as well, like the ritual and the sacrifice you do together, and you're in it together, right. and it's
exactly.
Others aren't experiencing this with us. There's something about that. Thank you. So one of the other interesting, so I think we share this sort of sense of a sentiocentric compassion that every sentient being warrants moral consideration and compassion. But one of the criticisms of a sentientist stance is they're saying, look, you're not going far enough, right? And you might find this in the modern environmental movement where people will say, look, we should care about ecosystems and, the biosphere, maybe living things that aren't sentient. Plants, for example, we should grant rights to rivers. We should think about the earth as Gaia, so on and so forth. So sentientism is too restrictive in your moral compassion. What do you think about that sort of challenge of people saying, look, you're not going far enough? And do you think we should grant direct moral consideration even beyond sentient beings?
I feel conflicted about it. So first, I should start by saying that I especially recognize, because I'm an anthropologist, and I know I have colleagues who work in different cultural environments, and I've read a lot about different perspectives that the idea of those things being radical, like extending rights to non-sentient entities or whatever word we want to use to describe them, a river, I guess we can say is an entity, but like a rock or a glacier or whatever, is new or conflicting with like this sort of Enlightenment history that we're coming from and situated in, but not for a lot of other cultures, especially indigenous cultures. So there's that. And I think that in itself supports a lot of thinking through what it might mean to try to do it in this sort of, I guess, this political, economic, and legal frameworks that we have in developed countries that are largely using up all the resources and the biggest ones impacting the planet. And so those discussions in the first place are especially relevant or salient for places like the United States or other countries that are doing a lot of damage. And so I think I see a strong case to be made there for very practical reasons about how we're impacting the environment, and that can be informed and thought through with sort of different epistemologies than the ones we're relying on. But as somebody who focuses mostly on animal issues, I also feel conflicted because I think it's intensely fascinating that plants can communicate with each other through fungal networks, and that there might be forms of awareness or sentience that exist in life forms that we don't understand yet because they don't have the analogous neurological structures. And so we assume that they can't otherwise experience the world in a certain way. And so so then that makes me sympathetic to the idea of a precautionary principle of trying to minimize harm to those things. But I'm also used to years of people saying, but what if carrots have feelings? When I say that I'm vegan,
exactly.
so there's a part of me that just strategically wants to say, I guess my response is let's keep being open to those possibilities and adjust if we've learned new things. But that's not a reason to like trash what we're doing now because we can't be universally pacifist towards every living thing on the planet.
Yeah. I really like that approach. Yeah.
The same way about AI, I found myself feeling a little bit like, wait, don't lump that in with us yet. Just like we don't have the animal thing figured out yet. We do not have to worry about how we're going to treat future AI because we still have to deal with the animals that are here now. And we also could just not make the AI, and then we're not making new sentience that will be suffering in some way, but let's still help the sentience we have. So I guess like I would say that's from the activist perspective, I find it like strategically problematic.
Yeah, yeah. And the approach I've come to so far is one is that sentientism doesn't tell us which beings are sentient and which aren't. It just says follow the science, take a naturalistic approach. So that does leave the door open for plant sentience or artificial sentience. It just says let's follow a naturalistic, prudent approach to working that out. And my current view is that I'm not aware of any serious scientists even claiming that plants, for example, actually have sentient experiences because of the lack of their motility and lack of a central nervous system and so on. But we should, remain open-minded, as you said, because we might be making simplistic assumptions there that, we come to regret later on. So I think that, acknowledging that fuzzy boundary and being willing to extend our attribution of sentience, if the evidence supports that, is absolutely the right approach. And that gives us the flexibility there. I guess when it comes to going beyond to biocentrism or ecocentrism or sort of more holistic thinking, I don't mind doing that, but I'm much more worried about excluding sentient beings than I am about including non-sentient entities, if that makes sense. And it strikes me that there are many people who have gone, right, okay, we care about all humans, we care about all sentient beings, and now I'm going to go further than that in good faith to care about living things and ecosystems. But they will still grant serious moral consideration to sentient beings. And they will also recognize that this characteristic of sentience, this capacity to suffer, does give you a distinctive moral weight over and above a rock or a river or a tree. So I think that's a good faith way of going beyond to biocentrism or ecocentrism. I guess my stance, I'm quite strict about a sentiocentric stance, but I go beyond that instrumentally. So I have a rich environmental concern because the environment is super important to all the sentient beings. But ultimately, that's why. So I care about rocks, rivers, and trees and ecosystems in the same way as somebody else might. But that's instrumental rather than thinking they warrant compassion as an entity that can experience things, because I don't think they can. So that's a different approach. But it seems to me that and I should come back to asking you questions in a minute, but I have to do a little bit of a rant. It seems like the center of gravity of the modern environmental movement is a third type, which says we're going to jump straight to a sort of rich ecocentric concern, but we're still going to conveniently exclude vast swathes of sentient beings in the world and in farms from our practical moral consideration. And that gives the lie to their ecocentrism, because their ecocentrism really is just a veneer on anthropocentrism, because the only reason they're really interested in the Earth as an ecosystem is because, it looks pretty. We want ecosystem services. We need a nice temperature range to continue to live in. And it's not really biocentric or ecocentric at all. It's just another expression of our deep-seated anthropocentrism. So that's why I come back to this idea that I don't mind if you want to go beyond, but don't exclude any of the sentient beings, because their suffering, clearly, distinctively does matter. And too many environmentalists lose sight of that.
I completely agree. And I would add to that as well. There's a way that exclusion of sentient beings also applies to lots of groups of humans.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And so
that problem isn't fixed yet by a long way. Yeah.
Right. And so I think there's a problem with deeply problematic issues with treating whether it's an ecosystem or whatever the argument is from this sort of ecocentric perspective. We need to save these things at all costs without considering the impacts that it will have on other humans. I think that there's a way to approach those concerns that does balance all those interests.
But you've got to recognize that those interests exist in the first place before you can do that work, can't you? Yeah. So that's been fascinating. Thank you. So we've answered what's real and who matters and what matters now. The final question, which is just as big, is how can we make a better future? And I'd love to dig into your work and your recent book, 2021 book, about sanctuaries and how they can play part of that. But before we get to that, as a cultural anthropologist, I'd be fascinated in your sort of big picture view about how can we make a better future? Because it strikes me that so many of the problems I talk about in these interviews, they're not really that technically difficult to fix. Quite often we have the technology, for example, plants, that we could just use instead. Or in the environmental crisis, we do have renewable technologies and various other things that we can, with a bit of work, switch to. Right? It seems to me that the central problem, the real big problems, are ones of human psychology and sociology and cultural norms and political will. And it's us humans just not being ready to take the right decisions, which doesn't really help. But so in that context, I'm interested in, as an anthropologist, how do you think big picture about how to make positive change happen?
I guess I should start by saying I think that there is no easy solution to that question from the anthropological perspective. I agree with you that we have the sort of material means to solve a lot of the problems that we're creating for ourselves and other sentient beings right now. But it would require big shifts in the way that we think about how we structure ourselves socially, how we distribute resources, who gets to count, to go back to the original question, who are we going to make sure isn't neglected and overlooked. And I mean, it's simple enough to say, comes up in every class I teach, but we're not going to solve those problems with neoliberal capitalism or global capitalism. The system is incapable of addressing those problems. Even if we said, oh, it's great for what it does, which I don't happen to think, it has an inability to address those problems because it permanently has to grow and use resources to expand profit and so on. And I just don't see us ever really getting to a better world as long as we don't shift that. So
the most positive reading of a sort of capitalist stance might be to say, look, at its root, capitalism is actually about respecting the individual sentient being's freedom to choose, right? The choose to consume, the choice to produce, the choice to do what we like. So in a way, capitalism is respecting those freedoms and then allowing, systems of cooperation and competition to emerge that will do stuff. And they might also layer in that, the problem with capitalism isn't capitalism as a system. It's maybe the values of the individuals in it that are maybe too selfish and they don't care enough about each other. But couldn't we move towards a more compassionate conservatism where, if you persuaded all 8 billion humans to be sentientists who genuinely cared about each other and all sentient beings, could you have a compassionate capitalism as well? What would you say to that sort of Panglossian hopeful vision for a radically different sort of capitalism? Do you think the system itself has flaws so much at its core that it can't be saved?
I do. I don't think that there's a compassionate capitalism that can't perpetuate major inequality, because it's the way the machine is sort of designed. It requires a constant inequality. If there was complete equality, then people wouldn't need to give their labor for less than it's worth in order to survive, and we would have a different system. It might not be whatever we've seen or even talked about socialism or communism being, but it would be something different. It would be a different mode of production. But I think that the first part of that question is really important, because it is this individualistic orientation that is really dominant in sort of a lot of Western worldviews anyway, that I think is partly the core of the problem. Like, I do blame capitalism, but I think more fundamentally, if people were to have a sense of themselves as part of a bigger social unit, which we are social animals, rather than starting from this position of, I get to make my choices, an idea of autonomy that is so grounded in individuals, and the prioritization or a valuing of that over everything else, is fertile ground for people to behave selfishly or badly. I've been teaching for in anthropology for 15 years now, and I've heard a lot less of this, but I used to hear people use human nature as an explanation for things all the time. And I just got to the point where you can't use that term, because it's not that we don't have tendencies as a species. It's that we have so many that it's sort of a not useful framework of understanding, because it's just like tautological. It's just whatever humans do, humans do. I mean, yes, we can be greedy. Yes, we can be self-interested. We can also be tremendously altruistic and practice mutual aid and make choices to like help other people. And none of these things are alien to being human or inherent to being human. They're just the whole range of human capacity. And so I think this is why culture can be so important, because culture shift towards that kind of empathy or appreciation for sentience or communality or connections to others, I think is an important component of whatever kind of practical plans we have or technological plans we're going to implement. Like, I would love to see alternative proteins entirely replace animal agriculture, but we're still going to have food injustice, and we're still going to have environmental problems, and we're still going to have a lot of the other stuff that comes with our modern food system if we don't also shift like how we think about food. Like, is food a right that all humans should have and we want to make sure they get it, or is food a commodity that some people can profit off of and other people have to spend their labor power to achieve and or obtain? And so these, I think that like there is it's hard to tease out the cultural and the social, but there's like the sociological elements of how society is organized and structured, but there's like this cultural element of what do we collectively value and perceive as important.
Thank you. And personally, I get to recognizing the importance of the communal and the group more through the individual, because I know those things are really important to individuals like me. So in a way, that's still quite an individualistic bias, if you like, right? It's the communal through the individual. And one of the challenges, I guess, of moving towards a more communal or group-based view is the risk that the individuals can get either forgotten or trampled, or there can be problems, whether that's, as we've seen in the past, challenges of authoritarianism or people using the authority of a group to erode the consideration of the individual as well. And you may not have an answer to this, but do you have a sense of, one, how can we avoid those well-intentioned moves towards a more communal way of thinking, manifesting those types of risks that can be more authoritarian or potentially even dangerous to individuals? And do you have a sense of what an alternative system might look like? Do you have a utopian vision for,
Yeah.
if you could persuade everybody to agree with you, or if you're a benign dictator, how would this thing look? How would this thing operate? How would we all?
Okay.
It's almost an unfair question to ask.
But years too. I mean, I'm an anarchist at heart, and I see my idea of a utopian society is probably a lot of small scale anarchist communes where people are not trying to organize at the scale that we have organized ourselves as humans, because I don't know that I honestly don't know that is manageable with any kind of system of equality that can not damage the environment and make sure that some people aren't suffering at the expense of for others' benefits, or maybe a vegan anarchist commune kind of situation. But practically, how can we make things better? Maybe not utopian. And I think that it's balancing. Well, this all goes back to the earlier part of our conversation too, about like utilitarianism versus this kind of consequentialism that treats all the individuals as important too. I don't think that appreciating a collective has to lead, or your social connections to others and your bonds to others has to lead to a situation in which individuals are being subsumed into this group mind, or people's interests are being put aside. I think the two things could be equally valued and balanced against each other and still function. I mean, I think that there's certain kind of positions that don't fit in those kind of environments. Like I find the claim by people who are perpetuating intolerant ideologies that their perspective should be treated as an inherent identity component that others will tolerate is contradictory and absurd. Like, I don't have to tolerate your racism or your sexism or your homophobia. I don't have to make a space to respect that in the bigger social collective. But as far as people wanting to be able to express themselves in whatever way they want to express themselves, I think that there's a lot of space that we could open up that is closed off in a lot of social settings and cultural milieux. Like it comes down to things like changing the way that we appreciate and respect our aesthetic production and art and things like that. We all love art and consume it in various ways, but a lot of us don't live in places that prioritize it very well, or make it easy for people who want to do it. And the same for education. Increasingly, people who want to be educators, that's a very important social role, but we don't prioritize that or make it easy. And so I think that I guess I'm kind of going down on a tangent now, but there's like small scale ways that we could do this. And then there's the big picture, which is just balancing the value of the individual and the collective at the same time.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's fascinating. And this is a slightly cheeky question. Do you think there's a risk that if we implemented or we move towards this sort of utopian anarchist collective vision that you have, that through a natural process of evolution and mutual aid and people deciding how to cooperate and sort of self-organizing governance modes, that over time, as people recognize the challenges of small-scale operations, whether it's resilience or economies of scale, that we would end up accidentally rebuilding capitalism through a sort of emerge. I mean, some people might argue that's almost what we've done historically, right? You've just started out from people working out how to cooperate, and these things emerge. But
it's a good question, and it's certainly possible. I think, in fact, it might even be probable if there isn't a sort of reorientation around. If we were to like wipe the slate clean, set everybody out in anarchist communes, but without changing any of the like cultural social perspectives we were just talking about, I could see it going easily back in that direction again, because there's sort of the
just drawn back to what we see as the default.
Yeah. But I don't think it's necessary. I don't think that there's anything inherent to humans as a collective that makes capitalism the constant end goal. I mean, Marx would, in Marx's teleology, capitalism is just a phase that we have to go through to get further.
Yeah, and just a stage. Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't know that I'm skeptical that it would be the guaranteed outcome every time.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, I think that the idea of the sort of anarchist, commune and the collective might be quite a nice segue into thinking about your work on sanctuaries, because I think that's part of the reason you found that ethnographic work so fascinating, because you were looking in a way for a case study of a radically different way of having multi-species relations and mutual aid and care. So how can I frame this? I think some people would look at the idea of sanctuaries and will say, it's a nice thing to do, right? It's something that's driven from a sort of maybe a sentimental way of thinking, where you want to have a local direct impact. You want to help the animals you can see in front of you. But it's local, it's narrow, it doesn't have a major impact. There are more strategic things we could be doing with our systems and so on. So, I sort of put it in a box as like a niche, nice, but not really that impactful idea. And I from your work, right, I've come to see it very differently, and I know you do too. But how do you think of, maybe you want to lay out the work you did and then how you've come to think of the role of sanctuaries in this cultural context?
Sure. So the book is called Saving Animals, Multi-Species Ecologies of Rescue and Care. And it's based on about a year and a half, 2-ish years of ethnographic research at a range of different sanctuaries for animals, animal sanctuaries, but also I worked at a shelter. And so I looked at companion animal rescue and care as well. And I definitely do see them. I mean, I was thinking of sanctuaries when I was talking about that sort of anarchist commune model. I think in many ways, a lot of sanctuaries do function as sort of interspecies anarchist commune models. One's based on a kind of ethics of care, where there are power dynamics. There are humans who can leave and come back and take on the responsibility to provision and care for, provision resources and care for other animals. So it's not non-hierarchical along every sort of measure of power dynamics, but I do see sanctuaries in general as these models of people trying to work through how you can prioritize individuals in a community and function in a community model. Now, they're not self-sufficient. I don't think there are any sanctuaries that grow all their own food and don't have to rely on donations or participation in the bigger nonprofit framework that exists under capitalism. So, as models or experiments, they can't test every aspect of that. But as far as their importance, I mean, I think anybody I've met who works at or runs a sanctuary will readily admit that they're not functioning as a mechanism for saving a vast number of animals from suffering. There are billions of animals killed every day just for food. And the number of animals at sanctuaries are so small that that would be considered statistically insignificant by anybody who's looking at statistics. But what I think really is missed in that conversation, well, two things. One is, I don't think it's fair to measure any kind of activism or intervention by what you want it to be able to do as opposed to what it's trying to do. And so it's somewhat a little bit like, I feel like unfair to even argue that sanctuaries aren't accomplishing this thing that they can't accomplish, so therefore they're not valuable. But if you look at what they actually can be contributing to,
and it also, I think it links to something you were talking about before, where there is this sense where we sort of pretend that a solution has to solve the whole problem for it to be valid. And you can, it's a common pushback for being vegan, for example. People will say, you as one consumer, it's a futility argument, right? Or an ineffectiveness argument. It doesn't really make a big difference to the system, so why do it? It's like, well, if you looked at any problem and said a solution has to solve 100% of it or it's not relevant, you'd never solve any problem, which sort of often is the point, right? So so it's the frame, right. That even small impacts are meaningful impacts, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think how you orient, I guess, like the early part of our conversation around our ethical orientations is going to determine that to a large extent. If you think every individual's existence is important and valuable, then there is meaning in rescuing 100 animals and giving them good lives, even if there's this horrible atrocity going on out there every day. And you think about that with the unhoused. Like, I don't think anybody's making a serious argument that because there's so many unhoused people, there shouldn't be shelters or support or opportunities for people. And it's not, having shelters is not giving everybody a house or a shelter to live in. There are still going to be people living out in the environment or in the bad weather and exposed to all kinds of unpleasant living situations. But I think the other thing, though, that sanctuaries and other efforts to help people and animals kind of demonstrate is, first, it's sort of a put into practice approach to that idea that everybody matters, but
like a demonstration, a model.
Right. And so it's a model of that kind of ethical orientation in the first place. But it also, I think, I believe this about sanctuaries, and it's very hard to measure. You can't do it from like a sort of effective altruist data perspective, that the very fact that there's a growing number of people who are dedicating their lives to creating these spaces to help animals that were negatively impacted by these bad systems that we were created becomes a part of the cultural consciousness. More and more people know that this is a thing. And that's how cultural shift happens over time. I mean, a really simplistic model is the Japanese stowing macaques who one started washing his or her sweet potato, and then the other ones noticed, and they all started doing it. And then within a couple of days or however long, everybody was washing their sweet potatoes. It's a lot more complex, the sanctuary model, but I think that it has a sort of immeasurable long-term impact on us as a collective, that there are people continuously insisting and demonstrating that these animal lives matter and that they're going to do something about it.
Yeah. And there can be challenges with people, physically visiting sanctuaries, right? That needs to be done carefully. But I think there's an important role there that in the intrahuman context is described under, I think it's intergroup contact theory, this idea that, you get less racist when you meet some people of other races. And, and I think the same sort of thing can happen with farmed animals, right? You spent some quality time with a puppy, you probably don't want to hurt one. If you spend some quality time with a pig, you probably don't want to hurt one. But that that doesn't just happen in person, as you said, right? That can happen from watching a YouTube video or just hearing about the work of a sanctuary, newspaper article, or just recognizing this different way of being is possible can ripple out, I guess, as well.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder sometimes if the sanctuary landscape looked the way it did when I was 14 and I was aware of it, if I would have switched my practices earlier. And I know that it would be inaccurate and then I think not productive argument to suggest that they're a panacea in that regard, that anybody who visits a sanctuary or reads about their work decides to go vegetarian or vegan and never goes back. But I do think that you're correct that is at least a contribution to what a choice somebody might make further down the line. Patrice Jones, who runs Vine Sanctuary, one of the co-founders, has talked about this in a recent article I was reading, that it's essentially impossible to attribute a person's like ethical choices or let's just say going vegan to one factor. I mean, my story sounded like it was attributed to one factor, but that was after years of on my own wanting to do that. I don't think that would have happened if I had never given a thought to the experience of animals. And then I heard that this bad stuff was happening. I would probably just thought, I don't want to think about that. I want a hamburger. So you cannot really measure all of the conscious and unconscious aspects that go into a person's path towards a particular moral direction. And I think that sanctuaries pretty clearly can and do play a role for a lot of people in influencing how they think about animals.
Yeah, agree. Do you think there could also be a practical role that sanctuaries can play as well? So again, getting back to this sort of utopian idea where we really can make some massive systemic shifts over time. Again, there's the trite, annoying troll on Twitter saying, what are we going to do with all the animals? And that's a problem that you and I would love to be facing, right? Where demand drops so rapidly that, that there are farmed animals that, need looking after. But do you think there is a role for sanctuaries as models in the practicalities of a just transition, either in helping individual animal farms, for example, transitioning to a model where part of their process would involve playing a sanctuary role, or more generally, that a role sanctuaries might come to play in some sort of systemic just transition as we move away from animal agriculture?
Yeah, I do. I think, it's important to understand that the vision for a sanctuary isn't this one universally shared vision across everybody who's founded a sanctuary. And there are differences of opinion and ethical orientation around questions like, should there be visitors coming to a sanctuary? Should the space be just for the animals? Should it be an opportunity for people to have these experiences where like you were just describing, where they have a one-on-one encounter that might impact them? And different sanctuaries make different choices. So there's not one standard, universal, agreed upon way to run a sanctuary to maximally benefit the animals there. That being said, and recognizing that many of all these variations on a sanctuary theme that could exist in the future wouldn't necessarily be meeting what a lot of people who run sanctuaries think are all the important, ticking all the important boxes as far as what's ethically appropriate for the animals. But I think there's also the practicality that we live in a world that's not doing that for animals at all. And we are increasingly going to find ourselves as a species, I think, having to find ways to either cohabitate with animals or eradicate them so that we don't have to be around them. But I mean, animals are losing their spaces. They're coming into urban spaces more. There's a lot of interactions that are happening outside of just like the way that we exploit domesticated animals, right? And I think that there are many ways to think through what that might look like that sanctuaries can certainly inform, and sometimes maybe offer a perfect model for, sometimes maybe just offer a perspective on how to think about it. But I do definitely see the sanctuary project as a necessary part of a future that's better about the way that we're living with animals. I think the ideal goal for all sanctuaries would be that they don't need to exist, that the animals don't need to be in captivity. But that Twitter troll comment thing is silly for multiple reasons, one of which it's not going to be a rapid drawdown, even if we were to get rid of it, right? Also, the idea that you somehow it's a worse tragedy of extinction, that animals that are bred to essentially have bodies that cause them lots of chronic pain as they get older are a loss to the world if we don't have industrial chickens still existing or whatever. I think, but if we did suddenly find ourselves lucky enough to have large amounts of animals that needed homes, the sanctuary models that exist are excellent ones for how to live with them.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's another important role. And I agree, it's a weird situation where I've described it before as it's almost like a deliberate extinction of entire species, but it's one that's repeated because we force breed their replacements over and over again every few weeks or months or days, depending on the species. And it's just a different context for me, right? People, again, it comes back to this frustration with people caring about species and extinction as concepts, but having zero regard for the billions or trillions of individual suffering beings that are in those categories. It seems weird. So yeah, animal agriculture to me feels like that sort of forced, relentless, repeated extinction over and over again.
That's a really apt description. I hadn't thought about it that way, but I think that's right.
Yeah. So let's leave sanctuaries there, but that's been fascinating. Thank you. I mean, it just really opens up the wider cultural role that I think sanctuaries can play, as well as the extremely practical role they're playing in helping, humans and non-humans care about each other and live happy, fulfilled lives. Before I let you go, one final question I had for you about this: how do we make a better future? Is the role of education. Humans have most of the power. So it strikes me, I mean, that's partly why I'm pushing the sentientism idea, is that if we can upgrade human epistemology and values, given they have all the power, that seems a good thing to focus on. And clearly education and your work teaching is a part of that story. How can we change the social defaults and the social norms? And as an amateur, it does seem to me that animal studies and animal relevant topics are like popping up and growing in distribution and popularity, and just the degree to which they're in becoming more of an integral part of academic curricula as well. So I'm interested in your thoughts about what it's like teaching animal courses and what the role of animal-centric education might be in some of these cultural shifts as well. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that subject before we wrap up.
Yeah, I totally agree with you that education is an important part of any kind of shift at an individual or species level. And I do think that we're seeing a growth of animal studies across a lot of different disciplines, which I think is a response to an increased interest among students as well. I think it's the two things are feeding each other. Where I teach at Wesleyan, I feel extremely fortunate to be able to teach almost entirely animal studies courses. And I have a lot of students who come in because they're really interested in thinking through this topic, but they're not coming in as vegans. They're not coming in as animal rights activists. And I don't see my classes as a way to convert people to the positions that I hold. I see them as a way to really ask the kind of questions that we've been talking about here and think through what the implications are, and then let them think about how they want to incorporate that into whatever they do once they leave college. But by approaching it in that way, I see a lot of people really shift I've been fortunate to have students from freshman to senior year take multiple classes and see the way that their thinking really shifts on a lot of things around animals. And maybe they still go out and they're not vegan or whatever as far as a personal choice, but they're definitely going out into the world with a much different idea of how we should treat animals, the role that they should play in society. And I think there's a lot of value in that.
Yeah, thank you. And do those students tend to see non-human animal topics as a distinct separate thing, or do they intuitively link it into intrahuman ethical causes and social justice causes?
Both. Some students, I think that there's an interesting sort of block for a lot of people that I've encountered teaching these courses, that you don't want to mingle human issues with animal issues because a whole range of reasons, but like a simplistic summary is that it in different ways risks dehumanizing humans. And I think, over the course of discussing it, though, it comes out that they do see connections that they don't necessarily see as connections. And then hopefully by the end of class, they're seeing a lot more connections, because I definitely try to emphasize those things. But so I definitely see a sort of already intuitive understanding and an openness to thinking about it that way, but a conscious sense that these should be separate. So both come up.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Well, that's been absolutely fascinating to talk to you. Thank you so much. Is there anything else you wanted to add into the conversation that I think we've answered all the big questions there are to ask.
No, this has been a really fun conversation. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. What's the best way of people following you, buying your book, keeping up to date with what you're up to?
Yeah, I don't have a website right now, so the best way to see new stuff that I would post on my Twitter account, which is Elan Abrell, at Elan Abrell. You can find the book on University of Minnesota website, or well, I won't suggest that big company that gives you cheap books, but you can find it on bookshop.org or other places in other countries. Yeah, that's probably the best place to find stuff for now.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Well, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you and to have you as a guest on Sentientist Conversations. And I think I'd like to claim you as a Sentientist. I think evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings seems to fit. So how can anyone disagree?
Yeah, I didn't disagree with anything you said. So.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks so much, and please stay in touch.
I will.
Take care.
Take care.